You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What if I told you you only have 12 hours to legally have sex?
To finding true love. Or just like a good guy.
From the director of Easy A and Anyone But You.
This whole thing is nuts.
There's nothing traditional about this night.
On August 7th, the clock starts on the summer's biggest rom-com.
I'm Owen.
Allie.
What about you and me?
Monica Barbaro, Callum Turner.
I've been told I'm a 7.
By who? Your mom?
Nah, she thinks I'm a 10.
One night only. Rated R. Only in theaters August 7th.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. Passengers are never allowed on board until the hold is full. You can't understand how you wound up here, on this desolate island, with no one for company except your elderly mother, no wine. Gods, why did he have to take away the wine? Only the most basic rations, only the meagerest portions, no luxuries of any sort, just you on this God's-cursed barren island. How could your father do this to you? You did everything right, everything he asked. First, you married your cousin. Then you married your father's best friend. Then you had as many heirs as your husband and father asked of you. You even married your stepbrother because your father had said that is what the empire needs, Julia. Your gloomy, gross, obnoxious stepbrother. And what did all that get you? What was the point of all that sacrifice? Of all those times you swallowed your pride and did what was asked of you? For the good of Rome. Why? You look out over the rocky cliffs. Sometimes you think about jumping. About throwing yourself into the sea and letting it swallow you whole. Sometimes it is all you can think about, but your mother stops you from those dark thoughts. You can't imagine leaving her here alone on this island. So for now, you wait, you bide your time, you pray to all the gods that your father will see reason, that he will recall you to Rome, that this is all just a bad dream.
You tried so hard to avoid this fate. You did everything right. You married your cousin. You went on all his military campaigns. You traveled from one end of the empire to the other. You bore his children, 6 children, 3 of them sons. You did everything expected of you. And yet, here you are, on the same barren island that your mother was exiled to by your grandfather. Things are blurry now, not with tears. You've long since shed all your tears. But because of the beating last week, that guard had always frightened you, and now you know your fears were correct. It had been the worst beating yet. The swelling in your eye has not gone down, and you fear in your heart that you'll lose it. Sometimes the pain still lances in from the socket and makes you scream. Perhaps the people have forgotten you already. They don't care what happens now. You always knew that once they did, there would be no protection. Yet another thing you were right about. You watch as a storm comes across the bay, wondering if your children are seeing the same weather. Your surviving children. You hope that they are faring better than you, because you did everything right. And Tiberius took everything from you. Your husband, your mother, your son, your sight. You did everything right, and this is where it got you. Onto this island, beaten half blind and waiting for the knife blade to slide between your ribs in the night. I'm Jen McMenemy.
And I'm Jenny Williamson. And this is Ancient History Fangirl. Well, that was grim, Jen.
I mean, we're getting to the end of our series on the Julio-Claudian wives, and spoiler, there is no winning.
So much cousin marrying, so much.
Cousin marrying, stepbrother marrying, all the marrying. It's wild.
Whoever it might be grossest to marry in any given moment, that's who your dad is going to tell you to marry. That's what it means to side with the autocracy, ladies. Get excited.
Look, this episode is probably going to piss you off, and it's going to be a lot. So strap in, have your favorite beverage or whatever of choice, and get ready to yell at us and the entire podcast because you're going to feel the rage. And mostly realize that everything in the world that is wrong in Western culture is probably Augustus's fault.
That's not going out on a limb at all.
Oh no, that might be my thesis of this entire season. With all that said, it's time to launch into the final part of our mini arc on the Julio-Claudian women. As I mentioned when I started this series, I've tried to keep it as focused as possible. It's not a comprehensive history of those women, but it's one that I think highlights some of their importance in how Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire. And maybe we see some echoes of that right now.
I don't know what you're talking about, Jen.
No, I have no idea why this might be a timely series for us. So, at this point in our story, Julia the Elder, the only living child of Augustus, is happily married to Agrippa, her father's best friend and his top general. Agrippa is roughly 25 years older than Julia, just for context.
We assume they're happily married. Circumstantial evidence seems to point that way.
Yeah, it seems to point that way, that Julia had a kind of freedom in this marriage that even if they weren't like happy, it was the best probably an arranged marriage you could expect.
What does happiness even mean, really?
Literally the next sentence, Jenny, before we jumped in was, or as happily married as anyone can be in the ancient world. When your dad forces you to marry his friend who is 25 years older than you. Julia was a teenager. She was 18 when she married Agrippa in 21 BC, and he was 43.
Awesome. So Agrippa was Augustus's best friend, probably the only person in the world who could stand to be in a room with him without
punching him in the face.
Losing control and punching his stupid face.
Such a punchable face.
And Agrippa was definitely the reason Augustus's plotting and scheming succeeded. He was like, the Wozniak to his Jobs. He was the reason Augustus won all his wars. There could be no Augustus without Agrippa. But Agrippa had also become dangerous for Augustus. Augustus had been warned by advisors to either make Agrippa his son-in-law or make him dead. This is because Agrippa had become incredibly popular both with the army, due to his many military campaigns and successes, and among the people. It's not that he was plotting against Augustus. They were besties. He was loyal. But if he ever changed his mind about that, he was positioned to do a lot of damage. Augustus kept his enemies as close to him as possible. He usually tried to manipulate them into becoming a member of his family, which isn't weird, not at all. Augustus loved to make things awkward for everyone. This is his favorite pastime.
Augustus just could not contain himself. He's like, ooh, could I make this even more awkward for everyone? I think so.
Does anyone at the dinner table want my sperm? Anyone?
I mean...
That's the level of awkward we're talking about here. So Augustus decided Agrippa was going to marry his newly single teenage daughter, Julia.
Julia, as we mentioned, as it happened, was newly single. She's widowed already as a teenager. She had married her cousin, also a teenager, I believe, or maybe early 20s, named Marcellus, and Agrippa had not been a fan of this marriage. He had recently sulked off to Lesbos in a huff because he'd had kind of a feud with Marcellus. He didn't like the dude. And Marcellus had become a golden boy in Rome, as we discussed in the last episode. And the way Augustus treated him, Marcellus was his favorite and his heir. This behavior really pissed Agrippa off. And the idea of Marcellus being the guy Agrippa would have to work with if anything happened to Augustus, well, it kind of sent Agrippa into a tizzy, and he gave himself his own form of exile rather than sort of flame out in public.
He exiled himself.
Now, I'm clearly being way over the top here and oversimplifying this, but let's be honest. Augustus made this a very tough time for Agrippa. He was threatened by the popular general, and I am sure he stoked the competition between Agrippa and Marcellus, because that was a thing Augustus really liked to do. And that competition got away from Augustus, right? Because not long after Agrippa left in 23 BC, at the age of 19, Marcellus died of plague or fever or maybe poisoning. And now Agrippa was ignoring Augustus's texts. What was a guy to do?
Well, obviously, what you do is you make your bestie your heir and marry him off to your newly widowed teenage daughter. Duh. This is just how you handle interpersonal conflict in ancient Rome. And of course, with Marcellus dead, Agrippa was now more than happy to return to Rome and marry Julia, and go back to being besties with Augustus, not to mention step into the heir position and, first guy position that Marcellus once had and that Agrippa no doubt felt entitled to, because he'd done all the work, he'd done all the heavy lifting, he'd led all the armies. Everybody back off. So this was a win-win for everyone. Agrippa got the heir position that he always felt he deserved, and for Augustus, that pesky heir problem was going to be sorted very shortly. Right?
Yeah, too sweet. It was going to happen. He figured it out. He had got his success, right? Everything was going to be great.
Yeah. So Jen feels like you can't discuss Augustus without bringing up his heir problem. And one of the problems with being Augustus's heir was that you were very likely to meet with a swift death. As we mentioned in our last episode, a lot of those deaths were kind of suspicious. They tended to happen far away, and they sort of looked like natural causes. There's a lot of very unfortunate accidents going on.
There's a lot of very unfortunate accidents.
Right, and many writers at the time believed there was a puppet master, perhaps a puppet mistress, behind the scenes, pulling all the strings. And we're talking about Livia. It's Livia. We're talking about Livia here. So Augustus had a series of very short-lived heirs, and spoiler, Agrippa also didn't live long enough to inherit. He and Julia had 5 kids, 3 of them boys. I think it's 3 of them boys. But none of them lived long enough either. It was just a spectacular run of, I suppose you could say, bad luck.
Or was it? So, we talked about Marcellus in our last episode. Again, Julia's first husband. He died at 19. He was the first ill-fated heir of Augustus. And now we're going to kind of touch on some of the others.
Basically just one of the others. Don't get too excited about a long list of these, but we might do that on the Patreon.
We're definitely going to do it on the Patreon. We're going to go through the deaths of the Augustus's other heirs and whether it was murder or accident or poison.
How likely it is that we think Livia did these people in. So if you would like to hear that, it will be on the Patreon at some point, maybe already, depending on when things drop. I don't know.
Exactly. So as we mentioned, because of the deaths of these heirs and Augustus's advancing age and his terrible fear of his own mortality, it created a huge problem. Augustus knew he wouldn't live forever, but he wanted to believe that the empire that he created would stand the test of time. And that meant that he needed a suitable heir and a succession plan, right? And he became really obsessed about it during the later years of his reign. And he lived a long time and reigned for a long time, so this was a real big bee in his bonnet. I really can't think of any clear way to explain this except to break down the heir issue and then go back and explain some of the conflict. So with all that said, here we go. Jenny, do you know the rhyme about Henry VIII's wives?
Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Heck yes, I do.
Right. I always think of that rhyme when I think about Augustus's heirs. So here it is in the order of their deaths went in. Died, maybe fever or poisoning. Died, on campaign. Died, riding accident. Died, on campaign, maybe poisoned. Died, fell ill returning to Rome. Survived. Fun, right?
Heck yes.
So after Marcellus died, Augustus picked his best friend, Agrippa, as his heir. And this was kind of a safe choice in that Agrippa was robust and healthy and a military guy who knew how to survive and had lived long enough in ancient Rome to have probably a strong immune system, we'd think. But also it was kind of a dangerous choice. Agrippa could also be Augustus's worst enemy, should he choose to be.
To mitigate that danger, Augustus made the calculated decision to keep Agrippa in the family, and Agrippa made the calculated decision to stay the fuck out of Rome and away from Augustus for most of his marriage to Julia. I get the sense that Agrippa was a straightforward soul who did not enjoy plotting. And this was for a variety of reasons, probably the least of which was that it was weird to be fucking the daughter of your best friend, because this is the ancient world and things are ick, and spoiler, that wasn't weird for him at all. I just don't believe that this was the thing that made him have to leave. I don't.
It wasn't.
I don't think he thought this was weird.
No! He thought this was totally normal. This was like the benefit of, I guess, knowing Julia since she was born. Ugh.
And giving her away the first time, and she's 18 and he's 43. She's more than half his age. Anyway, staying away from Augustus was a good move, it turns out, because it gave Julia and Agrippa freedom and space in their marriage, to have it belong to them and not just to Augustus as a tool to advance his agenda. This is a quote from Anneliese Friesenbach's book, Caesar's Wives. This book has been a huge source for the mini-arc, and we really cannot recommend it enough. Quote, like her stepmother Livia, Julia spent much of her time accompanying her husband on foreign tours, and her daughter Agrippina that would be Agrippina the Elder, is thought to have been born on the island of Lesbos, near the Turkish coast. Inscriptions and statues along the route that Agrippa and Julia took paid homage to the fertility of the emperor's visiting daughter, such as one in the Greek city of Priene, labeling her kaliteknos, meaning bearer of beautiful children.
Yeah, because that's what we're good for as women.
Jen, what would you define as romantic?
Are we talking like flowers and chocolate and candy and all that like real world bullshit, or the stuff I like to read about?
I'm talking about getting yourself kidnapped by your father's sworn enemy because the banquet needed livening up.
Are we talking about having your enemy/crush throw axes at your head for both kingship and pleasure?
That's like my type of competency porn. How about getting high in a weed sauna amid epic confusion about whether or not you're married to your sworn enemy? I love this so much.
Yeah, and how about a sweeping epic historical novel set during the fall of Rome, featuring Alaric of the Visigoths, a barbarian warlord, and a wayward imperial princess who just wants to take control of her own destiny. How does that sound, Jenny?
It sounds like my book, Enemy of My Dreams, which is available right now in hardback, ebook, and audio download wherever books are sold.
Pick up a copy. We promise it's one adventure you'll never want to escape. You know, Jenny, sometimes I get behind on my deadlines.
Really? I haven't noticed that.
Never. Not in this world. And that's when TaskRabbit really comes in handy.
You know, I use TaskRabbit when I am completely behind on everything. I don't have any time to spare, and I just feel like my apartment has devolved into clearly needing a very deep clean, and I don't want to do it, and I don't have time. That is when I use TaskRabbit. That's when it comes in clutch.
With my ADHD, sometimes just the terror of like how big a job is overwhelms me, and it's great to know that I can use TaskRabbit to help break down that big, overwhelming, terrifying cleaning job, because I also get overwhelmed with cleaning.
When life gets overwhelming, but your list of things to do just does not let up, TaskRabbit is there to help. Just pick a trusted tasker, and they'll come over and take those nagging tasks off your plate, often the same day.
And you know what, Jenny? It just feels great to have things handled.
You can hire a tasker based on cost, skill set, availability, and past client reviews. And often, you can hire them the same day, which I find very useful.
TaskRabbit connects you with skilled taskers in your area for moving, furniture assembly, home repairs, yard work, mounting, cleaning, and more.
Yeah, it's not just cleaning, it's for a lot of different things.
We just so happen to be your slobby aunts who need cleaners sometimes.
In particular, yes.
When life happens, your to-do list grows and grows and grows. Get ahead of it now and get $15 off your first task at TaskRabbit.com or on the TaskRabbit app using promo code FANGIRL. Taskers book up fast, especially for same-day tasks, so book trusted home help today.
That's $15 off your first task using promo code FANGIRL with the TaskRabbit app or at TaskRabbit.com.
Hi, I'm Ginny Urich, host of the 1000 Hours Outside podcast. And if you've ever caught yourself doom scrolling, who hasn't, or wondering if your kids are the weird ones or actually the normal ones, or if the AI apocalypse isn't coming but instead is already here, our show is for you. Each day, I talk with best-selling authors, entrepreneurs, doctors, educators, and thought leaders about the real challenges of modern life, raising kids, building meaningful work, navigating screens and AI, and creating a life that actually feels good to live. Join in the fun by searching for 1000 Hours Outside wherever you listen to your podcasts.
So, Agrippa and Julia were having a great time being very fertile, like as one does. Which was weirdly the main thing that Augustus wanted. He wanted babies, a lot of good Roman babies, born by the right Romans with the right credentials, the right pedigree.
I mean, he mostly wanted more and more heirs, but it went beyond that, as we'll see.
So, about 3 years into Julia's marriage to Agrippa, Augustus passed his Lex Julii. As we've discussed before, these laws were diabolical. They were designed to keep women in their place, that place being in the home, bearing lots of good Roman children. They made adultery for women, i.e. sleeping with anyone except your husband, illegal and punishable by exile, impoverishment, and divorce. Husbands and fathers had more latitude to kill a cheating wife with these laws.
The laws also made having a lot of children the central goal of every good Roman family. In fact, women who had 4 or more kids could achieve a form of emancipation. This is pretty much fictional, but we'll delve into that later. And the families got a tax break. More kids, big tax break, higher standing in society. This doesn't sound at all like anything we're seeing floating around right now, does it, John?
Oh no, I have no idea why. As soon as I saw something in our modern world, I immediately thought back to these laws and was like, oh fuck, we are so fucked.
So this is a quote from the National Women's Law Center. Quote, as policies inspired by this movement, that would be the natalist movement, begin to appear in national budgets and right-wing playbooks like Project 2025, it's important that we're cutting through the bullshit and asking who these quote-unquote pro-baby policies are really for. Beneath shiny medals for moms and $1,000 baby bonuses is a calculated effort to control women's bodies, restrict reproductive freedom, and prop up a narrow, exclusionary vision of family. Because honestly, to me, pro-baby, pro-family policies are things like paid parental leave, free childcare, free college, better housing support, a stronger social safety net, free healthcare, all of that stuff. That is pro-family, regardless of if you have babies, but also including babies. Like, I don't think it should be one or the other.
Being pro-family is Medicare for all. Universal healthcare, it's universal basic wage, it's protections for people's jobs in the coming AI wave. Regulating AI so we don't have data centers polluting drinking water.
It's regulating pollution, it's climate justice, it's unassailable abortion rights for everybody so you don't have to fear dying in childbirth if you have a miscarriage.
Yeah, it's gender care rights. It's protecting the rights of queer people.
Trans kids,
it's protecting the rights of people of color. It's protecting voting rights for everyone.
Immigrant families, what about them?
Free Palestine. We could go on forever. It's my next line literally that I scripted is very apropos is, are you getting angry yet?
Oh yes, Jen. Have I ever not been angry? Have I not been angry in the past decade? Probably not. All I do is rage while I've been researching and writing these episodes. Thank fuck for some wine and some weed soda, because if this isn't history repeating itself, I don't know what I'm looking at then. And as a childless woman, the idea that anyone, any government might value my worth as a human being based on my ability to produce a child or children or not produce them fills me with so much rage, mostly because it assumes so much about women. First, about their fertility. Not everyone can conceive or has the money for expensive IVF that is not covered. And not everyone wants kids. We don't define men by their ability to have children. So why put so much pressure on people having kids? Why? Because it's putting pressure on women and it's to control us. That's why.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's also because for women, unlike for men, there is a time clock that is already ticking, that our value is only during this certain amount of years when we can produce a child, right? Because eventually our bodies say, no, this is actually really arduous thing and we need to close shop right now.
And the bargain that we make with the patriarchy is always transactional. So if they can't get what they want out of us, which is usually babies, then we're worth nothing. Anyway, that's a bit of a spoiler, but let's move on. Again, let's go back to the National Women's Law Center, because what they have to say here about 2026 directly calls back to 1st century AD. Quote, get excited, get mad. Pronatalism is the belief that our society, including our government, has a duty to encourage people to have more children. The modern movement is born out of fears by famed capitalists like Elon Musk, who are concerned that declining birth rates will cause our economy to collapse. The evidence does not support this. What they won't tell you, at least not to your face, is that this movement is not really about declining birth rates. It's about power and which people have it. Most pronatalists are primarily concerned with increasing birth rates for certain groups, namely those who are white, conservative, and straight. It's why you may hear prominent pronatalists talking about, quote, declining genetic quality in the United States, or the importance of engineering, quote, good quality children. Both of these ugly sentiments are deeply entrenched in white nationalism and the racist fake science of eugenics. White House aides, along with prominent pronatalists outside the administration, have been reportedly looking at ways to encourage women to have more children. These include motherhood medals, government-funded infertility centers, and baby bonuses, which were included as part of the Republican budget bill in the form of $1,000 Trump accounts for newborns.
So what do you think, Jenny? You were the primary researcher on the Lex Julii episode. Does this sound like something Augustus would have dreamed up?
I mean, we covered this extensively in that episode. We talked about pronatalism and its connection to fascism and authoritarian rule, and how a lot of those types of governments have used a form of pronatalism in the past, including things like Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and Augustus's Rome. The Lex Julii are part of it, and so is Project 2025, Project 2026, and a lot of the items on the Trump agenda. So yes, I would say yes. And go listen to that episode if you haven't already, because it really does a deep dive on that.
It really does. And I just wanted to remind you all of that fact. So let's get back to the people who were living through the Lex Julii. A lot of the people that the Lex Julii targeted, wealthy men and women alike, did not like these laws. And they had some interesting ways of protesting. And before we go too far, I wanted to share this quote from Caesar's wives, because it turns out some of the ancients felt strongly about their options when it came to finding a way to retain their sexual and bodily autonomy under Augustus's laws. This is a quote, "The extent to which Augustus's legislation was actually enforced or enforceable is unknown. Many husbands and wives caught up in adultery charges probably preferred not to go through the public embarrassment and inconvenience of a trial. There were public demonstrations in favor of the law's repeal. One woman, named Vestilia, apparently even registered herself as a prostitute in order to avoid an adultery charge, a loophole closed under Augustus's successors. The poet Ovid, who was exiled to the Black Sea in the year for his persistent mockery of the Augustan regime, also adopted a subversive track, as well as advising men on how to chat up women at chariot races, the only sporting event given immunity from the new rules that relegated all women, with the sole exception of Vestal virgins and the women of the emperor's family, to the back of the theater and gladiatorial arena. His poetry offered wives tips on how to deceive their husband while flirting with their lover at dinner parties.
So yeah, a lot of people back then had their own subversive ways to protest. What's scary is how quickly those protests turned into exiles, and we will get to that. So, as we mentioned, for the second half of his life, Augustus, we can't stop saying this, take a drink whenever you hear us say it, suffered from an heir problem. And this was super stressful, not only for Augustus, but for the women in his life, and I would go out on a limb and say maybe the whole country. While he was in power, Augustus had spent a lot of his time restructuring the roles of women and really codifying how they could and couldn't wield power. And each of the women in his life, his wife, sister, daughter, and granddaughter, among many others, had something they wanted to gain from having power, or perceived power, be it safety, survival, freedom, agency, or status. But the nature of this power required a sacrifice. It required that women be complicit in their own oppression and also oppress other women, to look at the value of other women in regards to what their bodies could do, i.e. produce children, as well as the men that they were attached to, or if they didn't have any male attachments, and how their existence could benefit the paterfamilias in their lives, which is pretty dark.
So, in a world that disenfranchised women, one way they could still wield power was through their sons. And last episode, it was suggested that Octavia and Livia might have fallen out over the fact that Augustus favored Octavia's son, Marcellus, over Livia's, Tiberius, and chose Marcellus as his heir. This changed the power dynamics between the two women, meaning that Livia, Augustus's wife and empress, could potentially lose her status to Octavia when Augustus died or beforehand, right? Ancient sources tell us that Livia hated this idea so much that she might have poisoned Marcellus. Maybe. The reality is that a fever was going around Rome. It was the ancient world. Livia probably didn't have to go to the trouble of poisoning Marcellus. You can make a case for either theory, but in a way, it really doesn't matter, because Livia being jealous enough to poison her nephew, is the story that the patriarchy prefers. It pits women against each other.
So after 21 BC, when Julia and Agrippa married, making Agrippa heir, and then started having copious children, or extra heirs, it seemed like Augustus had solved his heir problem. But those heirs kept dying in mostly very normal ways. It happened with a frequency that has led to a lot of speculation. And the person who gets all the blame for these suspicious deaths, that was Livia. I'm sorry, Livia. It's Livia. I can't stop. I have to say it, Livia. Because Livia was getting quite a reputation for herself. One of immense power behind the great man. And Augustus was happy to promote this reputation. In his own journals, he wrote about how he turned to Livia in private life for advice on how to govern the empire. Why are we sharing all this stuff about Livia? Because it's important to know who she was and who Augustus wanted us to believe her to be. She was his wife, confidant, and the first lady of Rome. He valued her brain. He valued her mind. She's really smart. That's what he's telling us. And Livia understood this role. She knew how to play it to perfection.
He really wanted us to know that he valued her mind, he valued her brain, and also what a smart man he was to marry such a smart woman. So again, Anneliese Freysenbach tells us that Livia created sort of the blueprint of this chaste, modest, humble wife, a dutiful, perfect Roman matron. Quote, ... It won her the plaudits of loyalists who called her a worthy successor to the women of Rome's golden age, and inspired an anecdote that she once intervened to spare the lives of some men who were going to be put to death for straying into her line of sight while they were naked. For a chaste woman, such as herself, she said, naked men were no different from statues. But not everyone, it seems, admired Livia in the role of consort and confidant to the emperor. Quote, I have my part in reigning, she is supposed to have said in her conversation with Augustus about the Cinna conspiracy. It was an inflammatory sentiment, end quote. So above all, Livia was a survivor, and I firmly believe that Livia wanted to survive in a world that constantly changed and threatened her and her sons.
Yeah, I do think a lot of what she did was fear-driven.
Absolutely. You know, I think back to our first episode where the cold open is from her point of view. She was on the wrong side of that civil war after Caesar was assassinated. She was always afraid that she was going to be running in the woods again. So once Augustus's heirs started dying, first Agrippa in 12 BC, and then various grandsons and stepsons dropping like flies, including Livia's own son Drusus, and still Augustus refused to give her remaining son, his other stepson, Tiberius, the nod, Livia's role became really messy. And as a result, it's possible she became messy.
According to the ancient sources and Caesar's wives, Augustus and Livia had a very long marriage, over 50 years. That is a long time to be married to someone even by today's standards. By the ancient worlds, that's an eternity. But their marriage, while getting praise in public for its unity and strength, also attracted some wild rumors. Rumors that, as always, paint Livia in a bad light. Again, this is from Caesar's wives. Quote, one Roman historian writes of Augustus that Livia was, quote within the quote, the one woman whom he truly loved until his death. Yet, intriguingly, he also includes the information that in his old age, Livia herself enabled her husband's philandering by providing him with virgins, whom he had a passion for deflowering.
So, why do I bring all this up? Because now we're getting to the women-on-women violence. There's a lot to unpack here. First, you have Livia trying to keep her power by grooming and supplying young women for an old predatory Augustus as he moves into his dirty old man era, allegedly. We looked at this in the last episode, and it's important to bring it up again because Livia's position as first woman of the empire has now come under threat due to her husband refusing to favor her only surviving son, Tiberius, as his heir. Livia, as I've mentioned many times, was a survivor. What her survival might have looked like could have been supplying her husband with women or maybe poisoning any heirs who stood between her sons and the throne. And it might be that all of this is just slander from ancient sources who wanted to tar Livia as a bad woman who was desperate to remain in power. A grasping, cunning, ambitious woman, right? All of these things can be true at once, but they are all the villain arc or heel turn that Livia's character sees herself taking as we move into Julia the Elder's story.
Because Julia, Augustus's only surviving daughter, was set to take center stage as the next first woman of Rome. Her husband was Augustus's heir until he died, and then her sons, yes plural, were Augustus's heirs until they died. Julia the Elder, Augustus's only surviving child, had done everything her father asked of her. The task of populating her father's house with heirs fell entirely on her. She married her cousin, Marcellus, who died young, and then she married her dad's bestie, Agrippa, with whom she had 5 kids in rapid succession. She went from being a pampered princess to being the savior of the dynasty. In fact, Augustus was so thrilled with her marriage and fertility that he included her and her family in the Pax Romana buildings.
So I'm not going to dwell too much on these Pax Romana buildings because I actually have an episode planned on the time that Augustus went all Bob the Builder, and we'll be covering the Pax Romana stuff in particular. But the gist is that during the Pax Romana, or the legendary 200 years of peace that marked Rome's golden age, which was not peaceful and also not golden, there were several things built to commemorate the time. Augustus was obsessed with this. One of the things he built to commemorate his Pax was the Ara Pacis, or the Altar of Peace. He had the entire imperial family carved into one of the sides of the altar. Children, husbands, and heirs, alive and dead, grandchildren, wives, sisters, the whole clan. No one had ever seen anything like it before.
That's a Donald Trump reference. No one had ever seen anything like it before.
It was so beautiful. It was so big. No one had ever seen anything like it before. I don't even know if that's Trump. I feel like that's a very Long Island-y, but it's what I got. It was the biggest and the best. Anyway, so no one had ever carved their family onto official state architecture before, as far as I could see, but Augustus did. He did this to show off his extended family, the fertility of the Julio-Claudian clan, and to put their images alongside other legendary and mythical characters from Roman history that decorated the other sides of the altar. And if this sounds like a ballroom or an arch that might be happening in today's day and age, you're not wrong.
So here we're seeing Julia lauded as a model woman along with her aunt Octavia and her stepmother Livia. But history tells us something very different about Julia and all these other women. This is a quote from Caesar's wives about them and some other Julio-Claudian women we've covered. Quote, "So vilified are they that their names have been invoked by many as justifications for denying women a share in political power throughout the ages. Their faces held up, literally in some cases, as malignant and universal specters of murderous delinquency, promiscuity, and criminality. Because it turns out that despite marrying her cousin and then her dad's best friend and then her stepbrother, just as her dad told her to, having 5 children with said best friend and various other children with other husbands, getting that medal for having so many kids, becoming a model wife and mother, and getting her face carved in marble as that model wife, mother, and Roman matron, Julia the Elder is mostly known for being a slutty slut. Oh, good Lord, she could not rein it in, whose rampant sexuality and sexual agency almost brought down her father's reign. But Jen, how is that possible? Like we said, she did everything she was told to. She had all the babies. She's the reason that Augustus made that whole law saying women who had 4+ kids got a medal and a tax break and don't have to remarry when their husbands die. Did she not just do everything right and then she was allowed to do whatever she wanted afterwards? Isn't that the deal?
That was supposed to be the deal, right? She signed on the dotted line. She did all the things, right?
She can go and have all the post-incest ablutions she wants and no one's allowed to say anything. She had the babies.
Yes, she gave everyone the next generation. Why was her dad making things so hard for her? Well, let's get into it.
This summer, say I do.
I am marrying a stranger.
Like never before.
Am I crazy?
It's a whole new Married at First Sight on Peacock.
Thank God I woke up in love.
With new experts.
My name is Dr. Lisa.
My name is Paul Brunson.
More couples.
This could be the start of a very successful marriage.
And more surprises.
Or maybe not.
Everything is just not enough.
You're a little bit crazy.
I don't know what's gonna happen.
I want my fairy tale ending.
Married at First Sight, now streaming. New episodes Thursdays, only on Peacock.
Queen Carvania stood haloed by the morning sun. An army hung on her every word.
My champions, I have sold my chariot on Carvana. 'Twas a lovely SUV, an inexplicably queenly offer. They're even coming to the castle to collect it. Tonight, we feast! An offer you can feast on. Sell your car today on Carvana. Pickup fees may apply.
Julia and Agrippa were married for maybe 8 or 9 years and had 5 living children. Julia spent a lot of time with her husband, either on campaign, traveling to meet him, or at their villas, away from the watchful eye of Augustus. She also spent most of that time pregnant. But apparently, Julia also loved to play away from the marriage bed. She became known for this in the later years of Augustus's life, after Agrippa's death, but allegedly it occurred even while they were married, according to the ancient sources, that is. And it would seem that if Agrippa knew, he didn't mind. Because, remember, he could have had her killed, right? He could have brought her behavior up to Augustus and had her punished. It would have been super awkward, but he could have done it, but he didn't.
I mean, I do think that maybe the secret to their happy marriage was that both of them sort of turned a blind eye to what the other was doing at strategic points.
I think so, too. And probably that Agrippa was like, I don't know, I'm not going to get cuckolded by this bullshit. Like, I'm okay with it.
Maybe he liked it. Maybe they had a cuck chair.
Oh, maybe. I mean, maybe that was their kink. Like, I don't know.
Maybe Agrippa's in the cuck command center, just making sure everyone's hydrated, directing the action. Look, I don't know what this dude's kinks are.
Nobody knows what his kinks are. He's 43. He's seen some stuff. He's done some stuff. Maybe they had a more open relationship. Like, I don't know.
Look, I'm not judging as long as everything's consensual.
Absolutely. So, again, this is a quote from Caesar's wives. Quote, Augustus's biggest nemesis of all was his own daughter. In one piece of supreme irony, the demure poster girl of the Augustan ideal of womanhood, the only woman to appear thus far on coins minted at Rome, and the mother of two of Augustus's would-be successors, was turning out to be a popular, good-time girl with a steady stream of witty one-liners on the edge of her tongue, who privately chafed at the shackles imposed on her by her conservative father.
Julia was smart. She was married to a dude who let her do whatever she wanted within reason as long as she didn't make a giant deal about it. She liked the sex. She was able to flaunt her daddy's laws right in front of his own face. She was very different from the woman Augustus wanted her to be in public. In private, she liked to party, she liked to fuck, and she liked to do what she wanted. Here is more about the fraught relationship between Julia and her father from Caesar's wives. Quote, when Julia was asked how it was that all her children by Agrippa resembled him when she had so many other lovers, she is said to have made this pert reply, quote within the quote, passengers are never allowed on board until the hold is full, implying that she only let others into her bed once she was safely pregnant by her husband. I guess that's one way to handle the birth control.
Well, remember, they were married for maybe like 8 or 9 years and she had 5 living children. She was constantly pregnant. And it's possible that she just really enjoyed having sex and she's like, well, I would like to keep fucking and Agrippa is doing something else at the moment. Let's go.
Right. Nonetheless, Julia was apparently a popular figure with the public on account of her, quote, gentle humanity and kindly disposition. Those who were aware of her faults were astonished at the contradiction which her qualities implied. According to the stories repeated in the Saturnalia, Augustus at first adopted an indulgent rather than a stern attitude to his daughter, advising her to moderate, quote, the extravagance of her dress and the notoriety of her companions. He was offended when one day she came into his presence in a risque costume. The next day she came in wearing a demure dress and a prim expression and embraced her father, who was delighted at this show of respectable decorum. This dress, he remarked, is much more becoming in the daughter of Augustus. Julia had a reply ready. Yes, for today I am dressed to meet my father's eyes. Yesterday, it was for my husband's.
Gotta love it. So, Julia was good at soothing both her husband and her father's egos, right? While Agrippa was alive, that is. But after Agrippa died, something snapped for Julia. She had done everything right. She had married the men her father asked her to. She had given the empire 5 living children. According to her father's own laws, she should have been given her independence, allowed to never remarry if she didn't want to, and just quietly enjoy her affairs. Both her, sexual ones and her financial ones. But Augustus would not allow Julia to remain single, because single women with money and sexual agency are dangerous. But also, he had an heir problem, right? And he had a daughter who could solidify everything for him.
I mean, it's unclear to me at this point whether he actually did still have an heir problem, because a lot of her children would have still been alive, right? Or were they?
They would still have been alive, but he would need to make sure that if Julia was still of childbearing years around this time, she could still, have one more go around the park, right? You could still marry her off and bring somebody else into the family. Yeah.
It's really if you think about it, it's kind of amazing. If Livia was poisoning off or, killing off everybody on the down low who wasn't Tiberius, she wanted Tiberius to be the heir. And then Augustus keeps choosing other people. He's just kind of they're just sort of continuing this poisonous cycle together that wound up devouring all these women in his family, in his kingdom, and, for the next 2,000 years, let's say.
According to the ancient sources, at the urging of Livia, Augustus betrothed Julia to Tiberius. And he did this before Julia's mourning period for Agrippa was even over. Agrippa's barely in the ground or burnt or whatever, And it's hi, you're gonna marry your brother. This was a huge blow to Julia and to Tiberius, but it was a win for Livia, who now had Tiberius in line as heir. The problem is that Julia and Tiberius hated each other. Julia was sunny and witty and acerbic and fun, and Tiberius was a gloomy, emo goth kid. They'd grown up together and did not get along. They were step-siblings. I cannot stress that enough. And they could not have been two more different people. Julia wanted to remain single, or at the very least be given a choice in who she was remarried to. Tiberius, meanwhile, actually kind of liked his wife and didn't want to divorce her. So yeah, this marriage was doomed. Julia openly cheated on Tiberius, and he cheated on her with his previous wife. They had one living child together, poor baby Tiberius, and he actually died as an infant. But the marriage between these two was, as I'm sure you've gathered, not a happy one.
It was also embarrassing for both Augustus and Tiberius because Julia's wanton sexuality could not and would not be contained. Oh no.
Yeah, and remember, this might have been going on while Agrippa was around. It was on the down low. Nobody was allowed to fuck her until she was pregnant.
No passengers on the ship until the passenger, something about the hold.
So we don't have to worry that even if Agrippa's being cuckolded, right? He definitely got her pregnant, so we know they had sex at some point in time. But with Tiberius, they're just she's constantly cuckolding him. And they're not even pregnant the entire time. It's ugh.
So anyway, this is a quote from an article on History Extra by Eleanor Evans called Why Powerful Roman Women Were Branded Nymphomaniacs. Quote, Julia was so crazed for sex that she went down every night into the forum and sold sex to every passing boatman and gladiator. Or so the ancient Roman writer Seneca would have us believe. A daughter of the Emperor Augustus and an elite woman of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, Julia is infamous for her supposed sexual insatiability, for which she was denounced and cast into exile. That's right. In 2 BC, Augustus exiled Julia to the island of Pandateria because she kept going down to the forum and having sex with gladiators and boatmen.
Sailors and gladiators.
And also there were some trumped up charges of sedition in there. I don't know what's up with that. But anyway, Julia was forbidden to ever see her children again and was not allowed wine or rich food. Her mother Scribonia, at the time 70 years old, decided to go into exile with her so that Julia wouldn't be alone. The article offers this idea for why Julia was punished so harshly. Quote, the accusation of insatiable sexuality, Smith argues, was a convenient way to punish female visibility and autonomy. Quote within a quote, if a wife defied her husband in any way, that was an affront to the state. It all comes back to control. As for writers and historians who have since reinforced the stories, it's the appetite for the salacious, says Smith, far more than historical truth, that has driven the phenomenon. To reduce women to a simple label, murderess, adulterer, nymphomaniac, is to ignore the cruelty of their fates and their resilience and bravery in facing them.
Julia the Elder complied and did everything right. And she still wound up on an island in exile because ultimately, you can ask Pam Bondi or Christy Nome or Tulsi Gabbard about this, the patriarchy's promises to these women are worth less than the paper they're printed on. So we'll leave Julia for the moment. She's on the island of Pandateria, where she'll stay for roughly 5 years, starting in 2 BC. Her daughter, Julia the Younger, would also be exiled by Augustus for over 20 years, and she would die in exile, also over allegations of adultery. But the child we need to focus on right now is Agrippina the Elder, Julia the Elder's other daughter, her younger daughter, because Agrippina the Elder would be the mother and grandmother to 2 emperors and 1 empress. And she was formidable, much like her mother. Agrippina the Elder started out following her grandfather Augustus's rules. He selected a cousin for her to marry, Germanicus, and she married him willingly. And for all intents and purposes, their marriage seemed to be a happy one. And I couldn't track down the exact year of their marriage, but it was probably around 4 AD. They were about a year apart in age. He was a year older. And they both loved the idea of getting the fuck out of Augustus's household and Rome, because after Agrippa's death and before her marriage, Agrippina the Elder was brought into Augustus's household, and access to her was extremely restricted. He didn't want her to get any bad ideas or notions. He needed to keep her away from anyone who might turn her into a wayward princess, a slutty slut, a problem like her mother. He needed to make sure that Agrippina was raised the right way, the Roman way. She was the hope for the next generation. She needed to be educated in the good old Roman fashion. She was homeschooled and indoctrinated by all the best tutors. She would be everything her mother wasn't, everything Augustus needed her to be. And in a way, he got exactly what he wanted. In another way, he created a woman who could potentially bring down his empire, but we're getting there.
Everything comes back to how Augustus had an heir problem. We're just circling the same drain over and over again. And now we come to the last 2 men standing, the hugely unpopular Tiberius and the young, handsome, golden, beautiful Germanicus.
Our golden god.
Our blue-eyed prince. So here we have the sad, introverted Tiberius pitted against our golden boy, Germanicus. He was good-looking, he was outgoing, and he would go on to be a war hero, so the army loved him. Augustus decided to make Tiberius his heir as long as Tiberius adopted Germanicus as his heir in return. He also needed to know that the next generation, the one after Tiberius, was all taken care of. Everything was fine. There's an heir and then there's another heir. It's fine. And with that, in 14, Augustus died. Some say Livia poisoned him because people were always saying Livia poisoned people. Maybe because he was going to cut out Tiberius from the succession plans again. Maybe he was thinking about that. That's what some rumors said. But he was also well into his 70s at this point, so natural causes do seem kind of likely. Anyway, so Tiberius stepped in as emperor, and Germanicus, who was, I think, like 29 at this point, continued his military career. Like Julia the Elder and Agrippa before them, Germanicus took his wife with him on campaigns. Agrippina loved being away from Rome. She loved seeing the world. She loved having her independence. They had 6 children, and they were very, very happy together. Agrippina followed her mother Julia's example and stuck by her husband's side when he was at war. There are lots of famous stories of their adventures and her being a badass during military emergencies. Listen to our Germanicus the Manicus episodes for more details. And suffice it to say that the army loved and respected them both. They were a power couple, and this made them a real threat to Tiberius. Tiberius was deeply unpopular with everyone. He had no charisma, the upper classes hated him, the lower classes hated him, the soldiers hated him, and really he kind of felt the same way, like the feeling was mutual. He just wanted to chill on his Jeffrey Epstein sex island. He definitely did have a sex trafficking island, and not be bothered with ruling. The thing was, he had this young, handsome, golden boy heir who was waiting in the wings, being all sexy and tousled and attractive and tanned.
Those abs!
Oh my goodness, Germanicus with his shirt off. I'm pregnant just thinking about it.
We all are.
Oh my god, everybody take birth control right now.
While you still can.
Yeah, well, we still have access. Everyone liked Germanicus. Everyone would kind of rather Germanicus be emperor than Tiberius. Don't say that too loud. But sometimes they were saying it loud. I mean, the army sure was enjoying having Germanicus as their leader. They were all having a great time out there. Mostly genociding, but they were having a great time.
During the Pax Romana, where there were no wars. So, of course, it sure would be convenient for Tiberius if something unfortunate was to happen to Germanicus at this point. Maybe a fever or a loosened girth on his horse. But the troops would probably riot if any harm came to their favorite general, right? So Tiberius recalled Germanicus to Rome for a big celebratory triumph and a fancy new job. And that new job was going to be ruling the eastern side of the empire. On one hand, this looked like Tiberius was just giving Germanicus more responsibility so he could eventually step in as emperor himself, should the time come. But also, the Eastern Empire was very far away, and this was kind of a political exile. It's possible Tiberius's plan was to get Germanicus out of the public eye, make everyone forget about him, and then, a few years later, quietly make sure he met with some unfortunate accident. Germanicus was in his 30s at this point. He and Agrippina had a grand old time sightseeing on their way to the far-off eastern side of the empire. They had lots of adventures. Listen again to our episode on this. It's Germanicus the Manicus. But Germanicus had barely settled into his role of governor when, at the age of 33, he was struck down by a mysterious illness. Now, like Marcellus and others before him, there was a lot of speculation about this death. Germanicus had been hale and healthy just 5 minutes before he died. Was it possible that he died of malaria or West Nile or something else the ancient Romans wouldn't have had a treatment for? Yeah, that seems very probable. But a lot of ancient sources found that Germanicus's death was suspicious.
And we talked about why this was earlier, because at this point in time, Livia, Tiberius's mom, the empress dowager, I don't know if they actually had that title, but that's what she was, the poison empress, according to the ancient sources, was still alive and kicking and totally into poisoning people, allegedly. She was also more desperate than ever to keep her power and survive, because I think just knowing what Jen's told me about her, it seems less about abject power grasping than survival, although it could be a yes-and situation. Germanicus and his family were a threat to her son Tiberius. I mean, look, if people wind up murdering Tiberius and installing Germanicus as emperor, what's going to happen to her? She might have to run through the woods again.
And she's not young anymore. She's like well into her 70s.
Exactly. She's not so spry. So, wouldn't it be great if Germanicus just kind of quietly went away? I mean, wouldn't that be great for Livia in particular? I mean, it would also be great for Tiberius, but specifically it would be great for Livia. You know, Tiberius's rule was not without its problems. And Livia, after the death of Augustus, was having her own problems with her son Tiberius. That was another issue here, is that her stability was kind of threatened because Tiberius was not as protective of Livia and committed to Livia as Augustus was.
He was really mad at her for making him marry Julia.
Tiberius and Livia fought a lot during his reign. He did not want a hands-on mom/fixer as his co-emperor. He wasn't Augustus, and he wasn't afraid to let Livia know this. He was trying to cut her out. The ancient sources disagree on when they had their falling out. Some say it was as soon as Tiberius took the throne. He was like, "Mom, back off, stop nagging me, I got this." Some say it was after Germanicus' death. Probably it was the entire time. I think their relationship had probably at least been super fraught since Livia made him divorce his wife prior to Julia. Even if Tiberius did give his mom loads of honors, which he did, maybe it was all for show. But what we do know is that Livia feared losing her safety, her position, and her life, and she felt extra threatened on all sides after Augustus died. And I don't know, what's Livia do when she's feeling threatened? Well, she poisons somebody or has them killed in some way. So, if she felt that her relationship with Tiberius was being threatened by Germanicus, it would not surprise us that she had a role in poisoning him. That is psychologically possible, I suppose. In fact, we know that Livia petitioned for one of the people allegedly involved in the poisoning to be pardoned by Tiberius, which just makes the whole thing more suspect. For Agrippina, meanwhile, things turned very dark very quickly after her husband's death. She was on the other side of the empire with her entire family at that point, and her husband was dead. She had made enemies in Rome, including the powerful Empress Livia, but she had no choice but to return there because at this moment in time she had no power of her own, no property, no money, no way to provide for her children except to throw herself at the mercy of the people she suspected killed her beloved husband.
Needless to say, this situation turned very dark. Tacitus tells us about an incident shortly before Germanicus died. Quote, "Turning to his wife, Germanicus begged her, by her memories of himself and by their children, to forget her pride, submit to cruel fortune, and, back in Rome, to avoid provoking those stronger than herself by competing for their power." That was his public utterance. Privately, he said more, warning her of danger. So it was said from Tiberius. So, again, this is what he was saying in public, right? But in private, he was convinced that Tiberius had had him poisoned. Germanicus was warning his wife in private, while in public he was telling her to make peace. Spoiler alert, Agrippina had zero interest in making peace. But Germanicus felt that he had to warn her because he knew that her life and the lives of all 6 of their children hung in the balance. He had to let her know that while they had both done everything right, none of that mattered, because the people in charge saw them as a threat. They had outlived their usefulness, and now all they could do was try to fly under the radar and not make any waves. The lives of Agrippina and their children depended on it. But Agrippina did not have it in her to follow that advice. She had complied. She'd embraced her role as wife and mother. She'd had loads of children. She'd followed her husband on all his campaigns. She'd even followed him into this governorship, which she felt was tantamount to exile. And she'd done it all without complaint, the same way her mother had when she'd been married to Agrippa, because she knew what would happen if she complained. The memory of her mother Julia's exile at her own grandfather's hands was still fresh in her mind. It's important to note that not long before Germanicus' death, Agrippina had heard news that her mother Julia the Elder had also died. Before he had died, Augustus had recalled Julia from exile and allowed her to live in the town of Rhegium. She was initially allowed somewhat more freedom, but when Tiberius took power, he deprived Julia of money and property, leaving her desperately poor. He also forbid her to leave her house or have visitors. Rumors stated that she died of starvation not long after this, and that starvation was directly a result of Tiberius. So the news of Agrippina's mother's death at the hands of Tiberius, according to these rumors, was never far from Agrippina's mind. That alone was enough to drag her into a deep depression. And then Germanicus died under suspicious, poisony circumstances, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Things were about to get even bleaker.
Agrippina then had to return to Rome. She had to take her husband's ashes, her family, and return to the belly of the beast and live in the house of Tiberius, who had killed her mom and probably her husband. She had nowhere else to go. And if you think about it, that should not have been the case. The Lex Julii were supposed to emancipate women in Agrippina's position. She should have been free to own property and run her own household and not live with Tiberius. She'd had so many kids. She'd done all the things, but she was learning pretty quickly that there was no winning in this game. Agrippina had seen terrible things happen to her mother Julia, who had also done everything right. At first, Julia had chosen to live as loudly and sexually free as possible. And Julia was beloved by the people. Initially, if anything had happened to Julia, this would have caused an uprising. But eventually, Julia was exiled and kept away from Rome. The people who had once loved her kind of forgot about her. They had their own problems. That gave Tiberius a lot of leeway to have her killed when the time came and not suffer any consequences himself. And the same thing had happened to Germanicus. He was loved by the people, adored by the army, but once he was sent far away and out of the public eye, suddenly Tiberius could have him killed without risking riots. Agrippina had seen two of her loved ones, beloved by the public, murdered as soon as they were out of the public eye. Agrippina knew that she and her children were still beloved by the army and the people. They were the family of a tragically dead war hero, but that would only last as long as the public didn't forget about them. So she decided on a course of action that would have terrified Germanicus. She decided to use her voice to shove her presence and the presence of her children in the face of the public at all times. The only way to protect herself and her family was to be as loud as possible and ensure nobody ever forgot about them.
So, Agrippina began her long return journey to Rome. This was a very choreographed journey, with Agrippina in full mourning gear, clutching the urn of Germanicus in one hand and holding the hand of her toddler, one of her toddlers, with another. She stopped at all the stops along the way, letting people pay their respects, telling people about Germanicus's sudden death, how she couldn't be sure he was poisoned, but healthy men like Germanicus don't just die like that, and in such a strange way. She made a show of explaining how his body looked, how it wasn't normal, how that was definitely a sign that he was poisoned. And who would have a reason to poison him? She was just asking questions, Jenny. So Tacitus tells us, quote, Agrippina the elder herself, worn out with grief and physically ill, yet intolerant of every obstacle to revenge, went on board the fleet with her children and the ashes of Germanicus, amid universal pity, now carrying in her bosom the relics of the dead, uncertain of her vengeance, apprehensive for herself, cursed in that fruitfulness by which had borne but hostages to fortune. So by the time she made it back to Rome, Agrippina had succeeded in the first stage of her plan, make sure that the people of Rome couldn't forget about her and her family. This was the lesson she'd learned from her husband's death. From her mother's, the people of Rome had short memories. If you were outside of their minds for any period of time, they could forget you. And if they forgot you, well, you were vulnerable. And Agrippina knew that going back into the shark tank of imperial Rome meant that she had to firmly cement her family in the public eye. It was the only way to keep them safe.
So when Agrippina arrived back in Rome, she was at the mercy of her paterfamilias, Tiberius. And we keep harping on this, but I just keep having to say it. According to the Lex Julii, this should not have happened. Agrippina should have been able to have her independence from Tiberius's household. She'd had her brood of children, she'd done everything right, but Tiberius had changed the rules on her. Suddenly these goalposts had moved. You know, he was acting like her guardian. He refused to allow Agrippina to be independent. He refused to allow her to remarry. That was too dangerous. Anyone who married her could form a powerful alliance and then use her popularity to usurp him. They would be kind of in the inheriting, like the imperial family in line, and then they would have standing to cause an uprising if they wanted to. And Agrippina was, saying a lot of fighting words in that direction, shall we say.
Girl was talking seditiously, right? She was not being quiet about it. And anyone that she could couple up with, it would be a massive problem, right? Like that person would have all of her popularity, and depending on their wealth or their own status, they could potentially overthrow Tiberius. And he was aware of that. And Agrippina, I remember reading somewhere, I think it was in Emma Southon's book, that she was like, I'm lonely. I've got all these children to raise. I want to remarry. I'm young. And Tiberius is like, no way, babe.
Right, because he knows that she's going to find somebody with similar interests to hers, and her interests are mainly about overthrowing him.
Yup.
So, Tiberius refused also to allow Agrippina the Elder to grieve privately or even piece out of their awkward family dinners. He wanted her under his thumb, a position she'd been under before when her grandfather Augustus pulled a similar tactic. This was back when she was a kid. After her mother had been exiled and Agrippina had been forced into his household, Augustus had kept her under lock and key and tightly monitored access to her. This was that familiar cage again, but even more extreme, up to 11. She wasn't even allowed to mourn or grieve or decide whether or not to go to a dinner party. And there would be no marriage, no handsome hero to rescue her this time. She would have to rescue herself and her kids. So there's a famous incident at a dinner where Tiberius offered her mushrooms. There seems to be so much mushroom-related poisoning in this family line.
Oh yeah, well remember, mushrooms are delicious, but also like very poisonous, and you could easily fuck that up, right? And eat a poison. Even today, it's easy to accidentally eat a poison mushroom. So like, imagine, in the ancient world, like it's the same.
It's a plausible deniability side dish. Anyway, Agrippina was quite suspicious of these mushrooms. No idea why, I couldn't imagine why. Then Tiberius ate one right in front of her to demonstrate that he had not poisoned the mushrooms. The mushrooms weren't poisoned. The mushrooms were fine, or at least that one that I just ate was. And this had been a test of her loyalty to him, which she had failed. I guess she was supposed to eat the mushrooms, even though she suspected poisoning, to prove how loyal she was. Is that how it was supposed to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Agrippina knew how fraught her position was, so she did her best to drum up support for her sons to be made Tiberius's heirs, thinking that this would grant them all some level of safety. Tiberius had his own son, and no desire to make the kids of Germanicus his heirs. They were his competition. Agrippina continued to shout loudly to anyone who could hear that Tiberius had some kind of hand in her husband's death. And this was a huge headache for Tiberius. In the middle of all this, Tiberius' son and heir, Drusus, died under mysterious circumstances. He was poisoned by his wife. That is actually a poisoning. And we talk about this again in our Germanicus, the Manicus, our Ancient World Stark family series. Like, that was a legitimate poisoning. So anyway, after this happened, Tiberius went into isolation and deep mourning in Capri on his sex island. And he left the governing of Rome to Sejanus, his praetorian prefect. This would ultimately spell Agrippina's undoing, because Tiberius did not have time to deal with a woman who was fomenting revolt in Rome and loudly accusing him of murder. Nope. So he decided to take care of his Agrippina problem. Using his proxy Sejanus, Tiberius unleashed a series of trials on Agrippina's friends and supporters. They were tried for treason and misconduct. These trials chipped away at Agrippina's support network and left her and her family isolated, without the political support they needed to withstand the sustained political attacks from both Sejanus and Tiberius.
In 27 AD, Agrippina found herself under house arrest, confined to the family villa outside Herculaneum. She was charged with treason, sexual misconduct, and corruption, including sexual conduct with her son. None of this was true. She was not boning her son. She was not. And the Senate did not believe these lies, but they were ultimately forced by Tiberius to exile Agrippina. So in 29 AD, Agrippina was exiled to the same island as her mother, Julia the Elder, who is dead by now, so they weren't there at the same time. She was not treated well on this island. She was beaten so badly by one of the centurions who guarded her that she lost an eye. She remained on that island until her death, probably by starvation. Her two eldest sons were sent into exile or locked away in prison. I think at least Nero died in exile, right?
Yeah, Nero died in exile, and her other son, I think it was a Drusus, he died locked away by starvation.
Was this stuffing-eating Drusus?
It's the stuffing, yeah. He's the one who was being starved, so he ate the stuffing out of his mattress to try to survive.
But her four youngest children, this would be her 3 daughters and Caligula, who had been taken under the wing of Livia, would fare better. Livia looked after the children until she passed away at the age of 87. It was through her tutelage that once again, the dynasty would take on a huge change. When Tiberius died suddenly and maybe mysteriously himself, some say Caligula did it. We'll just fling accusations around. So, Livia had outlasted so many other people, but in the end, death comes for us all. She'd survived and shaped a dynasty. She was the last woman standing, but the bodies that had piled up in her rear view were allegedly stacked quite high. Allegedly. She is remembered as a schemer, a poisoner, allegedly, and a woman to be feared and not emulated. Augustus, on the other hand, well, we'll talk in another episode at some point about why the tech bro oligarchs love him so much.
So, what does this tell us about women and their relationship with the patriarchy? Well, it's that women's relationship to the patriarchy is completely transactional. As soon as they've served their purpose as a symbol, as a manufacturer of sons for the war machine, as a fixer for the men in their lives, as a gatekeeper for great men, as a way to make other women comply to men's laws, they are worthless. Yep. And when they step out of line or have too much power or have sexual agency or wealth or are beyond the patriarchy's control, or they just ask too many questions about their loved ones being murdered, they are squashed.
So I just want anyone out there considering simping for the Trump administration in any way, just bear in mind that this is the end game. This is where you end up, is in a cell, alone, with your eyeball on the floor and all your family members dead, and it is not going to go well. The autocrats will offer you power. They will offer you safety and status. You will be asked to do what you want to do anyway, which is maybe marry your hot cousin and have 6 of his babies. Look, I'm not judging. If you want to marry your cousin, go ahead, marry your cousin.
I mean, not your first cousin.
Look, I'm not telling people who to marry.
I think it's illegal to marry your first cousin.
The Romans built the aqueduct specifically for the purpose of post-incest ablutions. It's in Cicero, okay? Anyway, if you step into the role as the barrel-curled human shield for the patriarchy and enforcer of its boundaries, whatever you think you are going to get from that is not what you are going to get. In the end, the patriarchy takes everything. So that's it for this week.
And this little mini arc on the Julio-Claudian women. This was a tough one to research and write. Ultimately, I do think it's an important little mini arc that we did. And we will be branching into other topics about the fall of a republic, including building and propaganda and maybe Christianity. But that's all in the future. For now, thank you all so much for listening. You can find us on Instagram at Ancient History Fangirl, Threads and TikTok also at Ancient History Fangirl. We're most active on Instagram. Both Jenny and I have our own Instagrams. I'm at Jen McMenemy and Jenny is at Jenny Williamson Author. If you enjoy the work that we're doing and you want to continue helping to support the podcast, please consider becoming a patron.
That would be patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. That is our Patreon. And yeah, we would really love to see you over there. That is what supports the podcast at this point. We would not be able to do this work without our patrons.
And you do get things for being a patron. Early access to all of our episodes. They're ad-free. You get free minisodes each month, updates, behind-the-scenes stuff. And yeah, it's a good time. It's our after party. We let our hair down, and sometimes we even do some videos.
We don't have anyone to thank from our Patreon this month, so if you feel like joining, now potentially would be a good time. That's patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl.
Thank you so much, and we'll see you whenever we see you next.